Mark Galeotti is an author and academic by training a historian, but in practice an interdisciplinary scholar with interests encompassing politics, criminology, security studies, international relations, and anthropology. He's a specialist in transnational and organized crime, security affairs, Russian politics, Russian history, intelligence, and security. And he is also the host of one of the very best podcasts on the what's happening now within Russia, the repressive slide down, of course, the war. We're going to put links in the description of the video, and I strongly recommend you subscribe and check it out. Mark, I'm delighted to welcome you back.
Good to be back here.
And oh goodness, there is no shortage of things to discuss. Um, I assume you have been somewhat busy, and of course, I'm very grateful that you've made time to appear here, given how much is going on. And indeed, you are one of the go-to people on these issues, so I expect you've been rather in demand.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, that nice Mr. Putin has been keeping Russianists busy for quite some time now.
That's yes. I mean, it's tragic that it's in these circumstances, but I think it's important that we're now paying attention to some of the let's say the toxicity of the Russian system, because it seems to me that for a while, and part of Putin's beef with the West was driven by the fact that Russia was seen as irrelevant, had dropped out of the headlines, and ultimately was no longer feared. And that's something which the regime could not tolerate, actually.
Well, look, I'm not sure that the regime, in the past was particularly looking to be feared. I mean, that's something that came really as the relationship soured. Look, I've got to be honest. I think the real period of toxic irrelevance was actually the 1990s, when, in hindsight, Western policy was catastrophic in so many different ways. Again, I'm not trying to suggest that, oh, it's all the West's fault, it's all NATO's expansion, and all that sort of nonsense. But nonetheless, it is clear that that was part of the complex of factors that drove Russia in a particular direction and helped ensure that its new leader was not necessarily going to be Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, but nonetheless was going to be a Putin-like figure. And I think since then, yes, we've seen that Putin is committed to this, again, we can be glib and call it make Russia great again campaign. And from his point of view, he hasn't had the respect that is deserved. But I think it's not so much because we've been neglecting Russia. I think it's just rather that we are not willing to give Russia the status that Putin thinks it deserves. Putin thinks that Russia is a great power essentially as a birthright, and that a great power has certain privileges and perks in the international system, which, he looks at the United States and how the United States sort of does kind of claim certain privileges and perks of its own, and more or less says, well, if you are not allowing Russia that, then you are being aggressive, you are being hostile, you are denying Russia its rightful place in the world. And I think that helps explain a lot about the Putin drive. It is strangely defensive. It sounds as if I'm defending it. I'm not. I'm saying, as far as Putin is concerned, he is pushing back against a West that is trying to deny Russia something it deserves. And that has created so much of the bitterness and vitriol that was increasingly evident today.
And it's one of the problems, of course, seems to be the way power is defined. And I think in the West, it's of course military projection, but in representative democracies, although which of us now fall into that category is also potentially debatable. But it's also defined there by economic power, because your ability to project military force in some ways has to be linked to, I would say, a fair gathering of revenues. You need a certain base of wealth. The Russian system, and especially in this war, it seems to have accelerated it. There is a sense that actually that sort of representation, taxation, and military projection have a different dynamic, a different kind of link. And of course, in this war, in this attempt to reset Russian power, it does seem that Putin is burning up the country's resource, whether it be the sovereign wealth fund, whether it now be the trappings of modernity in the economy are being burnt up. That lack of representation is, I feel, going to cause immense issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think without wanting to make it seem as if representation is the key thing because we can see actually all kinds of economically dynamic but not exactly politically representative states. And just as we can see increasingly mired and stagnating democracies. But the point is, two things here really. To talk to your first point about the nature of power, I mean, I've long felt that really Putin is a 19th century geopolitician. I think he'd be a lot more recognizable to a Bismarck or a Metternich than to today's grey-suited figures. Because, from his point of view, exactly, power is the capacity to coerce. And we now look at all the other kind of indices that we look at modern power about technological dynamism, about diversity, about soft power, the capacity to actually influence by example. Well, I mean, I think he would regard all that as kind of hippie nonsense. Essentially, power is much more straightforward. It's about, a nation has to have a sphere of influence. A nation has to have the capacity and the will. And I think this is it, will he regards as part of sort of Russia's secret weapon to be able to use that power in order to bring about the effects that you want on the global system. So I think from his point of view, yeah, I mean, he is demonstrating Russia's power, or that was the idea, though in many ways the fact that he's still stuck in this ghastly stalemate in Ukraine, as you say, at terrible cost, arguably says quite the opposite. In terms of burning up the future, I mean, yes, this is for me is one of the tragedies. Again, one of my kind of hobby horse issues is to draw the comparison between Putin and Ivan the Terrible. Is that if you look at Ivan the Terrible's reign, the first half he was not exactly a nice figure, no one would say that, but nonetheless he was actually strikingly successful. He created institutions, he expanded the borders of Muscovy, brought in, for example, the Khanate of Kazan, making the empire a genuine empire, multinational, multi-confessional. And that as he increasingly sort of found himself embroiled in wars against people he really ought not to be fighting wars with, and also, frankly, as he slid into paranoid insanity. Actually, what happened is Ivan the Terrible destroyed so much of what he had created. Now, his reign ended in no heir and the period known as the Time of Troubles. I don't think we're going to see quite as catastrophic a period for Russia when Putin goes. But nonetheless, that sense, if you look at the first two Putin presidencies, and in part it was because he was extraordinarily lucky. He had oil and gas wealth to burn. He could improve the quality of life for ordinary Russians and dump money into building his military and allow the elite to embezzle to their heart's content and still had money left over. But nonetheless, also, I think that this was, frankly, in many ways successful, at least in Putin's own terms. Now, exactly, now Putin is losing so much of that. He's losing the coherence and the legitimacy that had been built around his state. He's losing money. Again, it's not that he's going to suddenly face an economic crash, but this kind of late Brezhnevism on fast forward sense of a shabby decline into stagnation under the burden of excessive security spending. He is losing, as you say, the trappings of modernity. I mean, I think it's easy to forget just how connected and how technologically dynamic Russia had become. And although it's not going to instantly disappear, even while the state tries to, or at least the security apparatus tries to kind of control the internet and so forth, but nonetheless, all of this does have a deadening effect on the economic dynamism, which has also been accelerated by the flight of so many young, technologically savvy Russians out of the country. So unfortunately, that capacity to see a sort of an upward and glittering trajectory for Russia is that much harder. Now, it is harder not to see the country facing, at best, and this is the optimistic scenario, a period of shabby decline even after the war is over and even after Putin is gone.
Yes, that seems the case. Let's draw some of those things together. So interesting that you say Putin's a 19th century figure, and it has been said that he doesn't really get the internet. What we're seeing at the moment, I know many people, even those who are losing their privileges of the internet, are blaming Roskomnadzor, which is a classic, blame the boyar, not the Tsar. But it almost certainly is that Putin is the driving force behind this repression of the internet. And actually, in the last couple of days, it seems to be accelerating. Yes, mobile internet. has experienced problems. Certain sites are down. VPNs are now being targeted. But it seems the latest one is blocking app payments. So really, they seem to be taking a sledgehammer to the entire digital ecosystem and just saying, everyone's going to be on Macs doesn't really cut it, I think, for most, let's say, Muscovites who are maybe a little more privileged than their, provincial, colleagues, etc. Is the regime not comprehending what they're doing here? Because this seems to be, not just cutting off your nose to spite your face. I think Michael Naki called it something somewhat cruder. Shooting yourself in the privates, I think, is how he described it. Is that the regime just doesn't understand the impact and is seeing the internet as some frothy kind of privilege that they can take away, and it's not going to have repercussions? Because it seems to me that actually this is a breakpoint for many people. Not that they're necessarily going to revolt, but it is a real breakpoint that the regime is impinging on their privilege in a huge way and inconveniencing their lives in a very tangible, noticeable way, a way in which the war hadn't quite percolated through to their sense of privilege and convenience.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues is we talk about the regime and they, and the thing is there is not one sort of coherent force, despite sort of Putin's occasional invocations of the power vertical. And I don't even necessarily think Putin is the driver. Putin is the driver of very few things. Other agencies are the drivers, and in this kind of dragon's den-like political system, they pitch ideas to the boss, and he will generally allow them to have their way. I think this is very clearly, this is coming from the security apparatus, for whom this is both a genuine concern in terms of the way that these signals can be used by Ukrainian drones to home in on targets, as well as the degree to which the political opposition, outside forces can use it to mobilize support. And indeed, ordinary Russians can use VPNs and the like to access foreign news sources. Admittedly, most of the time they're just simply looking at foreign films or whatever. But nonetheless,
And
they
share
can if they
footage of
want.
the strikes. It seems that that is also quite a strong motivating factor. They
Yeah, I mean,
don't want all
all
this.
of these are
Yeah.
factors that sort of play into, and also from the security apparatus, this is a chance to throw their weight around. And again, that is the nature of these sharp-elbowed bureaucratic politics, is that you need to demonstrate power, and that in a way gives you power, the ability to get away with things. On the other hand, it is worth noting that within the technocratic elite within the system, certainly within the business elite and such like, there is very evident concern. We can see this I mean, even in the fact that in what is essentially a state-controlled or state-influenced media, we are actually seeing a lot of critical coverage. And even the coverage that isn't critical is at best neutral. Unless you want to go into the realms of the more bizarro nationalist press outlets like Zagrad, you're not going to find full-throated support for this at all. Instead, you're going to see the business press talking up, for example, the cost to businesses when they can't use mobile payments and the like, or the sort of political technologists associated with the presidential administration, who are looking with some concern at the fact that this autumn there are going to be Duma elections. And of course, they're going to be thoroughly rigged, but in some ways, you want to have to rig them as little as possible. You want there to be this minimal gap between the real vote and the claimed vote. They themselves are noting precisely the effect on society. So I think what we're actually seeing is a playing out of a struggle within the system. And I don't think that the outcome is yet determined. I mean, for example, on Telegram, there are certainly quite a few people who think that Telegram will survive despite the current efforts to destroy or to muzzle it. VPNs, at one point we had a claim that basically they were working on a technological means to actually ban VPNs. Then we had the key figure from the State Duma, relevant State Duma committee saying, no, there is no such plan. Well, again, believe whom you want, but it's signs that there is not some kind of lockstep
And they're
thing.
not
So,
illegal yet. It's not
no,
technically
no,
legal
no,
to operate
exactly.
and own a VPN. No.
Which is why, to a degree, I mean, some of them specifically have been banned for various sort of, very specific reasons. But nonetheless, this is why it's being played out. I mean, I absolutely agree with you that this is a massive own goal. especially if it's actually followed through, and we're going to see sort of impositions of internet controls based around whitelisting and so forth throughout the country. And this is a way in which the war is coming home to ordinary Russians in a way that for many of them it hasn't before. And yes, of course, particularly Moscow, which after all, with its sort of seamless, Yandex taxis and eat and so forth, I mean, actually is a lot more, netted up and e-governed and generally convenient than pretty much any Western city one could care to name. But it's not just that. If you look out in the provinces, for example, WhatsApp is still sort of massively important as a means of, whether it's parents getting news about their kids' school timetables or news about Remont repair works in your block of flats or anything like that. Actually, this is one of these issues which is a genuinely national one, because in some ways, out of the main cities, it becomes more of a survival rather than a convenience instrument. So, it is entirely possible that once again, this state that has so often demonstrated its sort of elephantine clumsiness in dealing with its own people is indeed going to do what the Ukrainians have been trying to do, but up to now haven't really, which is to actually make this a genuinely national concern with impacts on people's sort of immediate and visible impacts on people's lives. Because so many of the other effects, and I'm sorry, I'm rambling on, I'll stop in a
No, no,
moment,
this
but
is a
it's going
very
to.
important
No, I
question.
mean, I think
Yeah.
that we have seen, for example, through the years, real term cuts in things like the budgets for healthcare and the like. None of those, though, tend to be instant effect. You don't notice if the cleaning schedule for your hospital has been slightly sort of extended, or if there isn't the budget to repair ambulances. So the hospital that had six ambulances now only has five. And what that means is there'll be a slightly longer wait before an ambulance can get to you. But it's not like something that people can instantly tell. This, on the other hand, is absolutely one of those things where one day you try to connect and you can't. You notice that.
It's rather than a boil the frog scenario, it seems to be a blend the frog, which they've seemed to have done here. There's so many ways in which this could go. I mean, the first thing I'll ask, because it's very rarely discussed actually, we talk about drone warfare, and actually the two nations on Earth that are most geared up to, I would say, drone warfare. And by that, I don't just mean, the things flying in the sky, but actually the evolution of electronic warfare. Russia is incredibly capable at this, but the connection is rarely made between, I would say, the digital activation, as you say, of governance, e-governance, the infrastructure of 24/7 delivery and so on. It does seem that Moscow was incredibly wired, as it were, which has escaped many people's notice in the way that Ukraine also was moving very far down that route. Again, Kiev and other places in Ukraine are far more, I would say, digitally integrated than most British cities, for instance, even London, and that level of convenience. Do you see a connection, therefore, between the capabilities that have emerged in the drone warfare and this rapid iteration, which requires behind the scenes, a lot of technical competence and infrastructure, and the fact that it's coming from two countries which are essentially had moved very, very fast and far down this, digital route?
Yes, absolutely. But it also, I think, demonstrates part of the practical and indeed philosophical difference between the Ukrainian and the Russian approaches. In that the Ukrainian approach, although it is becoming increasingly consolidated within sort of corporations and state initiatives, but nonetheless was very heavily driven from the first by individual grassroots initiative.
Still is to some
Unit
extent, I think.
still is to
Yeah,
some
yeah.
extent, but as I said, there are attempts to sort of scale it up because unfortunately that's a rapid but not an efficient approach. Whereas, no, I mean, the Russians have also demonstrated extraordinary flexibility and adaptation at a tactical level, if not at an operational and doctrinal level. But nonetheless, obviously not keeping up with the same pace as the Ukrainians. But the Russian advantage has been their capacity to then scale that up, to be able to take some of those innovations and then be able to produce them on a huge scale using all their industrial capacity. But what that has created in a way is again, don't make this sound too philosophical, but it is essentially a kind of a philosophical divide within the Russian system. That if you are someone like Chemizov, the head of Rostec, the large arms holding corporation, you may, on an abstract level, appreciate individual initiative. but you're working out how is it going to affect your bottom line and how can you basically ensure that it's your factories that are turning over, that are getting huge state contracts and churning out the kit. And frankly, you care less about whether it's the right kit. I mean, this is one of the long-term problems that the Russians have had, which is, and this is something that, again, back in the day when I could still travel to Russia, talking to Russian military officials, they would often say that in some ways what they get is not the kit they want, but the kit Rostec or other arms providers want to provide. I mean, the Armata tank, which has never been seen in battle still, is a classic case in point that it wasn't the soldiers' goal, but it was that Uralvagon Zavod wanted to produce this. Anyway, so in some ways, given that it's striking how far the Russian elite, unlike Putin, do not really see this as an existential conflict. They don't see a risk to themselves, at least not yet. And therefore, they are playing all these political and economic games. They feel that they have that kind of freedom of maneuver. I can't help but feel that part of what is going on, and this obviously links to the whole issue of internet shutdowns, but also just generally the relationship of industry to the initiative and the technological savviness that you do absolutely find within Russia, is that actually the latter is a bit of an inconvenience. You're kind of fine with accepting the fruits thereof, but the last thing you want is, shall we say, the focus to shift away from your cult of gigantism. So I think from the people like, I mean, again, maybe I'm doing that poor, badly misunderstood Mr. Chemezov a terrible disservice, but I can't help but feel that people like him actually are perfectly fine with seeing less technological innovation so long as it keeps them dominant in the economy. And this is actually one of the potential friction points with someone who actually Chemezov has fairly good personal relations, which is Defense Minister Belousov. I mean, when Belousov was one of the key figures behind the Rubicon drone project, which has created undoubtedly the most efficient of the various Russian drone units.
Yes,
That
Ukrainians
has,
very much take it
yeah,
seriously and fear it. Absolutely.
exactly.
Yeah.
And indeed, in some ways, part of the problem from Chemezov's point of view is the Rubicon is also committed to trying to spread what we could call, God help us, best practice and actually educate others in how best to use drones and what kind of drones should be used, and exactly this sort of relationship between ground forces, drones, and electronic warfare. In that respect, again, it challenges the kind of orthodoxies that Rostec and others would want to convey. So, we are seeing these struggles, and to put it very, very crudely, it is between young and old. It is between those who want to see bottom-up modernization and those who want to see top-down control. And although it's not at the moment being framed in political terms, this is exactly the kind of well springs that were behind Navalny's protest movement and could well be behind a degree of protest in the future.
We'll come on to those in a minute because there's been some interesting comments by, well, obviously Ilya Mislaw. Mikhail Zygar's produced an interesting article recently, but let's stay on this for a minute because you talked about the Ukrainian industry allowing innovation to bubble up. And obviously, there's huge inefficiencies, but there's a lot more testing, experimentation, a lot more of a, let's say, a diverse ecosystem, which actually is perhaps more inclined to produce solutions to problems in a very adaptive way. But there is a sort of formalization of that process taking place, but rather moving in the direction of large defense primes, which ironically could be compared to the challenges of Rustech actually and the West. Ukraine is introducing radical market forces at the same time as it formalizes and scales up. This incredible gamification or injection of a kind of real-time capitalist dynamic into, who gets commissioned, who gets paid, and relating that back to results, to actual effective results on the battlefield, something which the CEO of Rheinmetall seems to take great exception to in his recent comments. But that strikes me that slowly, painfully, that is ceding something of an advantage to Ukraine. If you can scale and formalize while inject this extraordinary dynamic mechanic into it, this could be ultimately a war winning over the longer term, a war-winning evolution.
Well, okay, I'm going to try and restrain myself from challenging. What do you mean by war winning, particularly? But let's not necessarily go
Yeah,
there because that's a
it's the
whole.
vertical versus the horizontal is
Yeah,
the
but
in very broad terms.
it's
But
a question. But the whole issue of quite what winning means for
yeah,
Ukraine is
well,
a
scaling.
massive
Yeah,
issue.
but
But
the
certainly,
idea.
yeah.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
no, no. Let me focus on the
yeah,
real point you make rather than my own pedantry. Um,
attriting troops, I think, probably, or being effective on the
Yeah, exactly. I
battlefield
mean, I
is
think
what I meant
that is
there.
clearly and exactly. I think, the goal is to essentially make any further attacks entirely unsupportable on a political, economic, and military basis. But in terms of this, yes, I mean, in theory, that could work. Now, of course, and look, I say this, I'm not a Ukraine specialist. I think it's always important to kind of stress that because there is sometimes a dangerous assumption absolutely challenging the whole nature of what this war is about, that somehow Russianists can also talk equally learnedly about Ukraine, and they can't, and they shouldn't.
That's
Um,
very fair. That's worth stating.
well,
Absolutely.
I think it is continued. Well, not least because I still find that people in the media will keep getting in touch with me and sort of want me to comment on Ukrainian politics. And I'm saying, seriously, guys, are you aware of the irony of doing so? I digress. To go back to this point, yes, of course, but it's going to be a really difficult thing to manage. I mean, first of all, it's going to be very hard to actually scale up to the level where you can actually compete with the Russians. Though, of course, it's not about direct competition. It's not about the sort of top Trump approach to war, where just simply if you have a higher number, you win. Secondly, I mean the real challenge is going to be exactly in maintaining the innovation while scaling up. Because the fact of the matter is that capitalism is not always great for innovation. You mentioned the issue about Rheinmetall, which is, an extraordinarily capable and market leading company. I can't help but feel that its CEO, in my opinion, Armin Paperga, is in some ways a kind of a brother under the skin of Mr. Chemezov in that,
Yes,
both
yes,
of them want to
absolutely.
maintain their market leadership, and that means they have to exalt their own product, which, for Rheinmetall famously is particularly the Leopard tank, though that's by no means all that they do, over the potential challenges there too. No one really wants to actually have to suddenly say, our industry is, if not obsolete, because the tank is not obsolescent, despite all these claims that somehow war has completely changed. War constantly is completely changing, and yet still actually tends to be very similar. But precisely what they can do is use their market position to squeeze out and down their competition. I think that's going to be the real challenge for Ukraine. And in fairness, from an outsider's point of view, it looks like a challenge that they haven't yet had the chance to demonstrate that they can do. They may well, I'm not saying that they're not, but it's going to be a very difficult point, this inflection point for Ukraine, moving from the what was Paperga's thing about housewives, making
Basically,
drones? Yeah, exactly.
is it? Yeah, the Ukrainians are basically housewives, building drones in their kitchens as if they're playing with Lego. So it seems to be inappropriate and inaccurate on multiple levels. Having said that, I have seen wonderful basements full of not housewives, teenage girls building drones. But also they're at pains to show the data sheets, the effectiveness, showing, well, where are they going, which battalion are using it, on which front, and show you the data. Well, okay, it took out this, that. I suspect he's sort of really missing all of the point there. It's
Hmm.
not whether they're, constructed in one of the, leading top 10 manufacturers or in a basement somewhere. It's the data gathering process of how you get it to the front. Is it effective? Is it usable? How many units out of the box work? How configurable are they? And are you gathering accurate data, which highlights both the benefit and the problem of that, and then feeding it back in real time to the manufacturer? All of this, obviously I'm rambling now, but that seems to be a fairly, insulting comment on multiple levels with a hint of sexism there as well.
I mean, he can be frankly commended for just how efficiently he managed to throw
Oh
so many
yeah,
slurs into
yeah,
just
that's
one
right. Yes,
statement.
Traditional German efficiency insulted everyone with a minimal word count. Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, so we'll have to see. Again, I think this is. This is really part of the process that we've seen from the beginning of the war, which in some ways at first was about military structures and also about nationhood, is that this war is absolutely the crucible from which a new and different and genuine Ukrainian nation has happened. I mean, one has to recognize that attempts at building a Ukrainian statehood, multiple ones before and particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, had been at best partially successful. They had always been sort of abortive. This, I think, is one that we see much more striking. And whether we're talking about exactly how a military which essentially functionally collapsed back in 2014 and was largely supplanted by local militias, rebuilt itself and has become, the arguably the most powerful army in Europe, how a state has constituted itself in a way that the old divisions between Orthodox and Catholic, West and East, indeed urban and rural to a degree, though that's probably the hardest one for any state to actually bridge, they matter so much less than they ever have. I mean, ironically enough, if there's one great triumph that Putin will be known for in history, it's as father of the Ukrainian nation. So it's not probably the one he was looking for. But now we're also seeing the war as a crucible for the potential new Ukrainian economy, which precisely has had so much of the old swept away. I mean, remember, the economic miracles of post-war Europe were not Britain and France, they were Germany and Italy, because the Allies had had the courtesy to bomb their industries flat so that they could be built from the ground up with the new technologies and understandings that had emerged in World War II. Well, what Ukraine is trying to do is, in a way, do that while the war is still going on. But nonetheless, it is fairly evident of the potential sort of economically and culturally dynamic processes that war, however, obviously, I'm not for a moment saying that it's a good thing that this war is happening, but I'm saying that actually something good can nonetheless come from it.
Oh, it's a transformative process. There's
Absolutely.
no question about that at all. But it's also transformative in Russia. It does not seem to be bringing forth an incredibly powerful civic society, although there are people who do, coordinate to assist their military, and there's a sort of there is a certain network of I call it dark civic activity because it's obviously it's supporting an invasion. It's supporting an invasion with genocidal characteristics. So, whereas I'm all for civic society, but in this instance, it's not to be commended. But it has been transformative on the Russian state in some ways as well. But it seems to be going backwards. It seems to be stripping away some of the layers of development that have been happening since the 1990s, and that leads to some interesting comments, indeed, by someone who, if people have watched the episodes here or in other places, Ilya Mislaw, a regime propaganda hack, who's come out with these 5 points. We're actually going further, it seems to me, than Prigozhin did, and we all kind of know how that ended. 5 points directly criticizing the Tsar, the demigod, which is one of the things you do not do in the system. You can indirectly, criticize Roskomnadzor or this person or that person, but you do not touch the figure of Putin, or bad things shall come to pass. What's your interpretation of this? Because it seems to me that I just don't believe that Remislav sat down one day, capriciously till, he lost his head and wrote these highly coherent critique of Putin. That just seems improbable. But what do you know about this? What do you think is happening in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll be honest, I don't know yet quite what's going on. I mean, again, I agree that the idea that this hack, who after all was also played a crucial role in the prosecution of Alexei Navalny, writing all sorts of denunciations and then indeed then testifying at Navalny's trial, that he suddenly had this epiphany and realized that, in fact, the regime for whose money he has trousered so enthusiastically for so long is, in fact, thoroughly bad. That, I mean, who knows? It's possible, but that's not necessarily my first assumption. So that we have, in a way, there's two strands of opinion. One of them is that this is actually all a provocation. It's that, Mislaw was really being used to try and firstly justify these controls on the internet. You see the kind of subversive stuff which gets transmitted on Telegram and the like. But also, this was an attempt to draw out other potentially sort of secret critics of the regime that, who, you know, metaphorically speaking, retweets these messages. And that at some point, Mislaw will be rehabilitated. And indeed, I have to say that the fact that he's in a psychiatric hospital, first thought, it sounds very much like the bad old Soviet days when dissidents were indeed forcibly interned and then pumped full of psychotropic drugs until they were indeed psychotic. Actually, it looks as if Remeslaw actually admitted himself.
Mm.
So I can't help wonder if this is either because he suddenly realized what kind of a hornet's nest he'd kicked over, or part of the plan is that it's building his alibi
Let's
so
face
that
it,
he can say,
there's no windows in a padded cell, put it that way.
yes, indeed. So that anyway, yes, he can justify, oh, it was a temporary breakdown. I have no idea what was being said. So that's kind of theory number one, is that this is all a kind of a cynical provocation, which is entirely possible, except precisely for the language he used. And particularly, the thing that struck me was that in a follow-up, he talked about Putin's family. He talked about the fact that Putin's daughters didn't have his name and saying, oh, it wasn't for security, it's because.
That's a no-go area. That
Yeah,
absolutely is a
exactly.
no-go.
You do not even, frankly, acknowledge the fact that Putin has a family, let alone present him as some kind of cowardly bully whose own daughters are trying to disown him. So I feel that if someone was writing Remeslaw a script, I'd be amazed if that was on it. The other answer is that this is a guy maybe who precisely thinks that um, the regime's time is coming to an end, and somehow that maybe he'd been sort of promised some kind of protection if he said these things, and he's now going to sort of again hide out in one asylum, maybe before he claims another kind of asylum. Um, Either way, though, the very fact that it's not just that I have no idea what's going on, it's that clearly Russians in the main have no idea what's going on. And there is still now, even though clearly this is not reaching the state press, but nonetheless, on social media and all sorts of other channels, there is a lot of feverish discussion about just what on earth is happening. I think it says something about the fact that there is a pervasive sense that this is a regime which is losing its way and losing its grip. And yeah, no one really knows which way it's going to go. It's not like go back to civil society. I mean, civil society is largely fueled by optimism. We've not yet got the kind of optimism that, actually, yes, indeed, the regime's days are numbered, therefore we can afford to protest and the like. But conversely, no one is thinking, well, look, the regime is rock solid, and therefore this is clearly all some kind of engineered dramaturgia. It speaks to, I think, a considerable level of dismay and disunity within society, and particularly within the kind of educated elite society that is the bedrock of this regime's not so much support, but management structures. The people on whom this regime actually relies to do the work of controlling and operating the country's machine. These are the people who are saying, what the hell is going on? And what does it say about how the old man? And again, I think it's fascinating. If I was a more quant person, I would be looking and had a handful of research assistants on whom I could unload all the tedious work. I'd be looking at actually how far we're getting references like old man study being used for Putin, because it's certainly on a very subjective level. Those kind of terms, to me, have seemed a lot more in evidence of late.
Yes, absolutely. And as people's privilege is touched, that's likely to accelerate in a way that they wouldn't have necessarily commented about the iniquity of the war or the crimes or whatever. And that's not purely Russian. I think people are triggered when their sense of personal privilege is challenged in every society, far more than, let's say, when abstract rights are curtailed. It's perhaps a little unusual in this day and age that Ukrainians, in 2014 came out more in support of these abstract rights, but also there was a lot of personal privilege and personal effects that they were protesting as well. There is, of course, the banal explanation that, and this is also maybe interesting as well, that Remisla simply wasn't being paid anymore. So he kind of genuinely did lose his mind a little bit and maybe had something of the hubris of a Vladimir Tatarsky and thought, well, I can say this and I'll be okay. And how dare they not pay me? I mean, that's a possibility too. And then called his uncle or whoever and said, quick, get me into your hospital. I need to get off the street.
Yeah.
But
It's
there's an
true, but if
implication,
if I
yeah.
can just dig into that just
Yes.
very quickly, because I mean you're absolutely right. But again, I think what it speaks to is, well, again, it speaks to the fact that this is a regime which so often manages to mess things up by just the most basic minor things. Once you've essentially acquired yourself a pet propagandist, why not just keep paying him, if that is indeed the case? But it's also the degree to which the cynicism that just assumes that actually what people say is purely built around how much and who is willing to pay them. That I think again is very telling because it is the sort of the norm in Russia for people to assume that, and that again undercuts this capacity of the state to present what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on more widely as some kind of either glorious or necessary or both national crusade. You're increasingly getting the state trying to find some kind of grand narrative that legitimizes everything that's going on, not just the war in Ukraine, but the economic hardships, the continued sort of frictions with the West and everything else in these terms as necessary for Russia in the sort of the grand scheme of its historical development. And I think it speaks to the fact that this just is not landing, that people are just basically assuming that this is all about power and money and factional rivalries.
And in the last bit, let's turn back to the internet because there's two questions that I wanted to sort of fling at you before the time's up. One is what is the actual impact on the front? Because it seems that a lot of the effectiveness, such as it is of Russian forces, is very dependent on communications and communication systems, and indeed in some of the hardware and tactics, it's an essential component. So, of course, you have squeals of privilege being challenged in cities. You have they take on a different character on the front, which is people are going to die and we're going to be less effective and we may cede advantage to Ukraine. So it'd be interesting to put that into some perspective, how significant that is. But in talking to because I have several, as you may have seen, I have several sort of, Russians in exile. It has to be said, they're not in the country naturally. But we talked about this internet, Mislaw, Zigar's article as well. And the theory around the internet is an interesting one because, of course, many Western commentators immediately try to latch on to Putin's paranoid, he's doing this because there's a coup and there's this and there's that, and it's because he moved against Shoigu and his group. And we immediately maybe try to impose a Western framework or what would our societies do and to try to explain it. Whereas in conversations with Elvira Bari, Konstantin Salmalov, and several others, I think we concluded, and I'd love to have your point of view, that actually this is Putin creating options for himself by creating this extraordinary slide to a further repressive measure. That actually he's creating the option to either dial the war down and control what he perceives as the risk of doing that, the blowback, or dial the war up. And he may not even know which way he's going to go. It may be contingent on things like Iran and external factors as well. But he's creating an option for himself to be able to move without necessarily, experiencing the full blast of either nationalist, fervor if the war's dialed down, or let's say a civic response if it's dialed up.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree and kind of challenge part of it. Oh no, Putin is not a strategist. He's a tactical opportunist. And to that end, he always wants opportunities. Now, whether or not he is consciously thinking in these terms, I think what we can say is Putin has created a system which will allow him those opportunities. He gives the security apparatus their head now. It doesn't mean for a moment that he can't tomorrow ride in on his metaphorical white horse and say, I have been shocked to discover what's happening to the online internet space. and particularly how this is affecting our brave boys at the front line. And clearly, we're going to have to rethink that. Or alternatively, he can say, of course, this has my full support, and in fact, if anything doesn't go far enough, he always has that opportunity. So, is it that he's actually thinking in these terms? I think this is where I have a slight problem because it implies that there is necessarily some kind of potential inflection point coming.
Ziegler
And
suggests that there was back in February that he was
yeah,
thinking of dialing down, but again, I'm a
I'm
little
not entirely
skeptical on that. Yeah.
convinced, and I find it striking how many, again, emigre Russian journalists, and maybe it's just peak, but who are suspicious about the level of unnamed sources on which Ziegler, who is, let's be honest, a great writer and an excellent journalist, but nonetheless, whether or not they really give the weight sufficient to hold this story. I'm not convinced. I didn't really see signs. I would love to wonder. I mean, if it was true in February, then it could be true again. So I would love to believe it to be the case, but I'm afraid I'm a little bit too cynical for that. No, so I think absolutely Putin will always maintain opportunities, but I still don't think this is ultimately something that comes from the top. Putin is not, on the whole, an initiator. I mean, in fact, arguably the Ukraine war was one of his great examples of something he did initiate, and we know how well that's worked out for him. On the whole, it's precisely that Putin will, at different times, allow different interest groups to have their way, to see how it goes, because he then reserves unto himself the right always to be able to change it. And I think that therefore, what this to me speaks of is precisely escalating tensions, a widening gap between the interests of the technocrats, who frankly have never been enthusiastic about this war. But look, they're patriots. If you're in a war, you'd rather your country win it than lose it. And anyway, their careers depend on this. So to really, their main role has been just to try and manage things as effectively as possible, regardless of the stupid instructions coming from above. And the security apparatus who see their own opportunities being massively expanded. I mean, you talked about the effect on the front line. I mean, again, I think we have to bear in mind that there's always the temptation to think of this as some kind of silver bullet moment. Actually, the Russians have demonstrated themselves to be, just as they are astonishingly incapable, it seems, of predicting problems before they happen and being ready for them, they have proven to be actually strikingly successful in cobbling together responses to those problems. So I'm sure, despite whatever going on with Telegram and indeed the Starlink lockouts, which again clearly had a significant impact on them, they are creating workarounds. That's going to happen. But meanwhile, at home, I think that this is about the security agencies, yes, in part being paranoid about potential problems. Again, they are preparing themselves for the risk of growing opposition in some form or other, perhaps triggered by an end to the war, return of the veterans scarred and angry, or perhaps exactly an escalation, which will probably mean mobilizing reservists and sending conscripts, which again will be politically very problematic. But also, this is their chance to flex their muscles and earn revenue. Because if they can control the internet and they can control the whitelists of those sites which are still able to be contacted, well, basically what that means is that they can metaphorically sit back and say, what will you pay me to get your URL on that whitelist? So I think this is Putinism once again devouring itself because of the logic of this system of multiple competitive, philosophically, but above all, economically acquisitive institutions.
And of course, it blows this sort of Western naivety out of the water, the idea that somehow this is a system on the verge of revolution. Somehow, we've got these sort of nascent, powerful sort of liberal elite just waiting to overturn this bad autocracy. The picture you paint is actually no, this is a system that is very likely to outlive Putin, and there isn't this fervor to tear apart the power vertical and destroy this rent management kind of system, coercion control. No, this
I mean, I
is
think that
deeply entrenched.
there is an awareness. I mean, yes, look, this is not going to suddenly become a happy liberal Western democracy. Not that many Western democracies are happy these days. It is that actually we should put our faith in the kleptocrats and the technocrats. Is there a lot of people who do feel that this war was a disastrous mistake? They don't see the point, whether it's because they just want to be able to enjoy their opportunities to steal in peace and enjoy a nice Western enhanced lifestyle, or whether it's precisely that they are aware of just how dysfunctional it is. I think that the best case scenario we're looking for a post-Putin future is precisely something that's more like early Putinism, political control, but not excessively repressive, essentially just self-interested more than anything else. And, let's be perfectly honest, what share of the global population live under regimes like that? And they're not necessarily catastrophic for world peace or indeed the lives of the people within them. And they're obviously very, very good for the Swiss banking economy. Um, but I think if I can just dig in on that point about revolution and such like, which is highly unlikely, and coups much the same. But nonetheless, this is a system which is getting more brittle. It's strong, but it's brittle. It's losing those kind of reserves that it could call upon. And one of them in particular, I mean, if there's one thing that we can bring from the rather surreal Prigozhin mutiny, it is the degree to which many elements within the security apparatus did not rush either to join, but also to resist the mutiny. You had basically a force of about 3,000 guys rolling up the motorway towards Moscow. And until the Oka River, there were no serious defenses being thrown up to stop them. I mean, that just should not happen. And the reason it happened is because precisely all the various forces which were on the route, which could have been blowing up bridges or barricading roads or whatever else, just thought they'd find reasons to evade being given direct orders and just see what happens. I think that's what we're seeing now. We're actually seeing a situation in which the regime is losing its support base. So that if there is some kind of black swan event, and it might be something natural, a Chernobyl disaster or something like that, or some kind of coup, or what may happen if, let's say, Putin is debilitated by illness or whatever. In those circumstances, it's not that people would immediately take to the streets to bring the regime down. It's that many of the people whose job is to keep the regime up might well think, oh, as they did in August 1991 during the hardliners coup then, I'll stay at home today. I'll call in sick and just see what happens. I think that is the thing. It's a hollowing out of the regime more than anything else.
That's it. And whoever comes in, if they were to restore the privilege of the urban population by restoring elements of the internet and so on, they'd probably be embraced pretty quickly. People wouldn't be looking for a root and branch change, just the return of their privileges that have been suspended. Maybe enough for many people to embrace a different regime.
Absolutely.
Mark, thank you so much. It's been a thrilling discussion, as it always is. I think we've had far more to cover even than we have in previous conversations, and fortunately we got through most of it this time. So I'm very grateful for that, and I think the audience will be too. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Before we carry on with this video, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported the channel through 2025, and all those, of course, who are contemplating supporting us in 2026. We've run many events on the ground in the UK, Europe, and indeed in Ukraine as well. And some of the images of those events are on the screen as you see this. Your assistance has been absolutely invaluable to making it happen. And in 2026, we won't be able to do this scale of activity, have this impact, or even think about having these ambitions without your help and support. There are many ways you can help. Of course, liking, subscribing, making sure you are actually subscribed to the channel, because sometimes YouTube seems to kick people off their subscriptions unexpectedly. But actually also adding comments and sharing materials around your network. It all has a tremendous impact. Now, I know many people watching this channel contribute to Ukrainian charities and do what they can, but aren't necessarily people of huge means. But if you can, if you're able to, and if you see value in this work, please do contribute if you can. We have links to Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and even GoFundMe. That is all in the description of the video. Any support you can give will make sure that we can have not just the same level of impact this year as we did last year, but we can actually increase it. And the aim, in fact, is to double our impact this year, to go from reaching about 1.5 million people per month with our content, doubling that to 3 million, and also doing many, many more events to help support Ukraine, help support the concept of democracy and resilience. And as we know, 2026 is turning out to be even more dangerous than 2025 was, and the existential threat to democracy, freedom, Ukraine, those aligned with Ukraine, is greater now, perhaps, than it has been at any time since the full-scale war. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for all of your support.